It's nice to be here. It's always important to me to do anything I can to help the mission of the Vincent de Paul Society because of not only the people that I know in it in Canberra, but the members that I've met across the country for many, many years. And I think anybody who understands what the Vincent de Paul is about would do anything to help. The Royal Commission is slowly grinding to its conclusion. Remember when Julia Gillard announced the Royal Commission, originally it was going to be for 3 years and then the extension happened. Do you know these days all the papers are full of polling, but when Julia Gillard announced the Royal Commission, in the history of political surveys, there had not been a more popular announcement. It was something like 90% approval ratings from all demographics. Australia needed this Royal Commission because this is a major social problem. Unfortunately for the Catholic Church, it's a major moral problem, and it's an extraordinary indictment on what is the nature of the Catholic Church. There's no other way of seeing it. You can't abuse children systematically for decades and at the same time seek to be a mouthpiece for moral standards in the community and expect people to get that. In our gut, we know that the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church in this area is writ large. In our gut, we know that there's a major disconnect between what the Catholic Church's faith proclaims and how we are to seek the true, the good and the beautiful in our life, and how the Catholic Church systematically covered up the abuse of children. There's no use finessing the argument. The Royal Commission has had 44 case studies so far, of which we have been part of 14. And when I started this job, some fellows used to say to me, "Francis, the problem with this whole exercise is it's a beat up by the media. It's a beat up by the ABC and the Fairfax Press. Every time they want to talk about child sex abuse, there's a photograph or there's film footage of a Catholic church or a cardinal. This is just old secular prejudice against the Catholic Church. Why is it that we're always in the news?" Well, just like we're finding with the Trump-Clinton arrangement, it's always handy to have some facts. The Royal Commission has two processes running. One is case studies, examining particular instances where they're not trying to prove if someone abused anybody, that's already been proven. They're wanting to discover how the institution handled the matter, because the formal title of this Royal Commission is the institutional response. Okay, so they're looking at what the institution did. But the other side, and most important side too, of the Royal Commission, it's a bit like what happened in South Africa. They're trying to provide people with an opportunity to tell their story, maybe for the first time. Do you realise that only 1 in 6 adults ever tell anybody, any time, about what happened to them as a child? That's why maybe for some of you this is really, a close story. A lot of people carry this secret with them all their lives. They tell no one. Some people are fortunate enough to be able to move on in their life, others are caught by it. And they get caught in all sorts of ways. People that your conference and conferences sometimes deal with. People that are caught in poverty because they can't hold employment. They can't hold relationships. They can't hold their anger. People who find that normal functioning in everyday life is just too difficult because they have been trapped by the scars of the abuse. So the Royal Commission enables people to come and tell their story. This means they go into a room privately, there'll be a counselling service available, there'll be some commissioners available, and maybe up to 1.5 hours they literally tell what happened to them. And recently the Royal Commissioner, Peter McClellan, announced some of those statistics. And what we're going to know is that when that process is done, the Royal Commission would have heard from 7,200 people. Now that's quite a lot of people. And those that thought this Royal Commission was going to be a waste of time said, oh, you know, it might get 1,000 people. 7,200. And we know what will happen is that gives courage and encouragement to others to come and tell their story. And this will run out of time. And it's probably important, I think, that our governments think about that and whether there needs to be other mechanisms in place established by governments to enable people to continue to come and tell their stories. Because stories of child sex abuse are just one story amongst many. But interestingly, of those 7,200 people, the trend is indicating that up to about 5,000 different institutions are named in those stories. An institution is a parish, a school, a Vincent de Paul conference, a sports club, a foster care service. So over 5,000 of those. And what is telling is that 70% of those are owned and operated by faith-based organisations. So 30% by government, 70% by faith-based. But unfortunately, of the 7,200 people that will go through that process, the indications at the moment are that 40% of those people are talking about abuse in the Catholic Church. On the Royal Commission's data, the Catholic Church is the single largest institutional grouping that's delivered child sex abuse in Australia. You know why we're in the news? Because we make the news. That's the problem. And you know what? People in the community know it. I'm not talking just statistics. People know it in their gut. That's why this is popular. That's why this needs to happen. That's why, in a sense, grueling though it may be, the truth needs to be revealed. And that's why, if you're in any way associated with the Catholic Church like me, you may be having the same experience as me, which is firstly anger, then a sense of real corrosion. It's very demoralising. And it's terribly important. I don't wish to make this a sermon, but it's terribly important to hang on to what you think is your sense of faith. It's not about faith in a church. It's about something bigger than that, huh? Because something bigger than that has driven us to this point, and that's what you need to hang on to. When we surveyed the community about this issue, we asked the community, when the church leadership talks about child sex abuse, how trustworthy are they? Now, we surveyed 3 groups. We surveyed practicing Catholics, Catholics more broadly, those that are in the census or ever filled it in, and the great unwashed. And as I said to some people on a lighter moment, the best part about our survey is we found all these practicing Catholics. But when we asked the question, practicing Catholics, around 6 to 7 out of 10 said untrustworthy. Catholics more broadly, 8 out of 10 untrustworthy. The community generally, 7.5 out of 10 untrustworthy. So if you've got 8 out of 10 people saying, I don't trust you, you've got 8 out of 10 people saying, I don't listen to you, you've got 8 out of 10 people saying, I don't want anything to do with you. So it's a pretty sad situation, and I want to make it abundantly clear that the council is not trying to be the council so that people will again start to believe in the Catholic Church, because I don't think we could ever deliver that KPI. We are keen on making sure that there are no obstacles in place so that this Royal Commission will actually have an opportunity to examine things openly, transparently, fairly, and then make a judgment. So that's where we're at. And I have had people come up to me and say, yeah, but come on, Francis. You know, why aren't we out there telling people about all the good the Catholic Church is doing? You know, our schools are full. Well, kids have got to go somewhere. Our hospitals are full. Well, people have got to go somewhere. Our welfare services are overrun. People need help. Why aren't we making it clear that there's more to the church than the sex abuse scandal? Well, firstly, you can't have a clear image when you have such a scar in front of it. When you have been living in the shadows, openly, intentionally living in the shadows. But secondly, when the Royal Commission opened up, the Chief Commissioner, Peter McClellan, made an opening address. And one of the things that struck me about his address was, he said, this Royal Commission is about bearing witness. In other words, we as a community are going to stand and bear witness about what happened. And for that to occur, you need to give people the space to tell their story. Now, there's no point in the Catholic Church trying to get out there to fill up the airways with how great it is as another attempt at trying to silence the voices. That's not what we're about. Sure, that means that the Catholic Church is vulnerable, but hello, not a bad idea at the moment to take a humble, vulnerable position, just like the Pope says we're meant to be. So I'm following the boss. And secondly, the Church for too long has used its might, its resources, its intelligent supporters to try and manage this away, to keep it out of the public sphere, to keep it private and silent. And this is the problem we're going to face. Sure, we've had our 14 case studies, and there have been case studies that you've probably followed to various degrees. If you're like a lot of people, you don't want to hear it anymore. But you know, there's been case studies in WA dealing with the Christian Brothers and their agricultural schools and the systematic abuse that went on there for years and years and years of those migrant children. We've had case studies in South Australia, basically around a school bus driver of disabled students, and again, a horrid affair. We've had case studies about the girls' orphanage and boys' orphanage up in Queensland run by the Sisters of Mercy. And then we drop down into the real epicentres in New South Wales, in Newcastle, where we've seen case studies involving the Diocese and the Maris brothers. Into Canberra again with the Maris brothers, and then into Melbourne, of course, with the Doveton parish, which was really high profile recently, and then to a small little town west of Melbourne, Ballarat, which of course at that point it was sort of like the high point and in a sense, the crescendo of so many things coming together, not only about the diocese but also the Christian Brothers. There are many, many other examples, and there are many other religious congregations that have not been subject to the case studies. Simply time is running out. But there are some things to be proud of. I mean this sincerely. When we started this exercise, we were not the first country to start looking at the Catholic Church and child sex abuse. There'd recently been reports and inquiries of this type in Ireland. There have been consistent, if at least judicial type inquiries in the United States. There is already a fledgling inquiry in the UK, and there's been something like one in Scotland. The scandal is becoming more public and more reported on in places like Germany. But interestingly, church officials, be they cardinals or archbishops or even spokesmen for the Holy Father, would usually say this: we, the Catholic Church, are extraordinarily sorry about what has happened. We are so sorry about the dreadful, despicable actions of some of our priests. Not many, but some of our priests and brothers. We want the victims to know they have all of our support. And everyone would hear that and go, nah, you missed the point. You don't get it. And this type of apology has been going on in the Catholic Church for 20 years. We said as a council to the archbishops and religious leaders, no, you have to be much more transparent than that. You have to realise that one of the biggest sins in this process has been the active cover-up and denial by the leadership of the Church. It's not just about the fact there were perpetrators, it's about how they were handled. That's the sin that we're really cross about. That's the sin that requires major reform. We get the fact people will be perpetrators. We don't like it, you've got to get rid of it, but you can't run in a world of denial. Even worse, you can't run in a world that openly facilitates their action. So the bishops and religious leaders in the first hearing of the Royal Commission had read out a major statement, a commitment statement. Now, most people go, oh, here we go again. But what I'm proud of are some aspects of it. In the opening part, you might think some of this is obvious, but bear with me. Sexual abuse of a child by a priest or a religious is a crime. And you go, yeah. But do you know, even now in our case studies, we get people saying, commissioners asking some of our witnesses, well, Brother Sullivan, was it a crime to abuse that boy in 1986? And sometimes the answer comes back, I'm not sure what the law was in 1986. And the commissioner, after taking breath, says, Brother Sullivan, sorry, I didn't ask you was it legal. I asked you was it a crime. Of course it's a crime. Abusing a child. It doesn't matter what the statute says. And this became a problem in the church. The confusion some people had about the moral failure and the law. And what have we had over 30 years? Lawyers and insurers advising bishops how to be bishops. How to actually be a moral leader. Don't say this, don't say that. Don't admit this, don't admit that. Find out all you can to make sure the person's wrong. Now that's a great legal strategy if you're running a trucking company. But it's not much if you're running a church. Okay? Secondly, so firstly, it's a crime. And next, it goes on to say, the church is also ashamed to acknowledge that in some cases, those in positions of authority concealed or covered up what they knew of the facts, moved perpetrators to another place, and thereby enabled them to offend again, or failed to report matters to the police when they should have. That behaviour is indefensible. Can I tell you that that paragraph is the first time in any grouping of bishops and religious leaders anywhere in the Western world has that been said. That was the first time at the end of 2013. Nowhere else. Even the Holy Father, who I bat for the Holy Father, I think he's a cracker, but even he is still not completely there in the way he talks about this sort of thing. He's getting there, like everything else that's supposed to be happening, but the Vatican is still caught up in the clerical world, and the clerical world is about justification, contextualising, minimalising, rationalising, keeping the show going. But the trouble is, the show has been exposed for what it was. And the mob, maybe you're included in this mob, I am, don't cop that show. That's not what I am part of a church for. That's not why I join others in seeking the true, the good and the beautiful. So the leaders in of the church at least took that leap. The second big leap that I'm proud of happens in February next year. Because in February next year, the Royal Commission will hold its final hearing on the Catholic Church. Stop cheering. I even had to restrain myself the other day in the case study when Justice McClellan was reminding people that they'll have the final hearing on the Catholic Church in February. I was going to stand up and sort of with arms raised, holler relief. But that hearing may go 3 or 4 weeks, and the whole purpose is to look at why did this happen in the Catholic Church? Sure, it's happened in other churches. Sure, it's, we've got people that have abused children in institutional settings run by governments and private organisations. But how come? Not only has it happened in the Catholic Church, why was it handled this way? And not only that, why has there been so much of it? And why do we know that? With the Royal Commission, again a world first. Everywhere else in the world, the Catholic Church has been very difficult to get on with when it comes to public inquiries. Will you get the files? Will you not get the files? Who gets to turn up? Will the lawyers get involved? So we've taken these decisions. One, no one who goes to the Royal Commission will claim any legal privilege. Anything they've ever written or anything like that becomes available. 2, we never cross-examine victim survivors about their experience. Never. They tell their story, they're not interrupted, they're not cross-examined. That's our position. And 3, we have made available all the data from 1950 to 2010 of the Catholic Church and child sex abuse. There are no files that have gone missing. There wasn't a full-time, uni student paid to do shredding. I had 3 of them at the house at the time prepared to offer, but that, on good rates. But we've got the files have all gone in, the data is all in. The data identifies the perpetrators by name. The data says when the abuse occurred. The data says how much people were paid if they got a payment. The data says whether these people were sent to the police or not, and so on and so on and so on. So you can expect, as we do, that in February that the data will be released in some form. Probably, quantums, this many people, this percentage of priests or this percentage of brothers and so on. Again, a world first, but exceptionally important so people, the community and others can see, and I mean this, I sincerely mean this, that we have attempted to participate without complaint, without condition, to be open and transparent, to have the story told as it needs to be told, analysed objectively. Sure, some other people have their views on the stats or their views on the causes. And let me just rattle off a few of the causes before we go to the questions. When you talk about institutions, institutions have their own life. They have their own way of viewing things. That's what companies are like, organisations are like. The literature says it's called a culture. Everything has a culture. Your family has a culture, right? The Bulldogs have a culture of losing. Except this week. Except this week. Just like the Dockers. Just like the Dockers. But the point is, we all have a culture. And the church has a culture. Now, tomes have been written about this. But it's important when you're looking at something like sex abuse to understand it's generally accepted that sexual abuse is an abuse of power. So if you decide to look at the Catholic Church in three areas: power, privilege, participation. If you take just those three headings, you can start to put a frame around what the culture looks like. If you're an official that's trying to deny or keep quiet or hide the dark side, you're doing that because you are committed to the integrity of the organisation, not to the victim. You put the interests of the show first, the victim second. The propensity to do that is usually because you, in that organisation, have a future that you see is going to be benefited by the organisation staying the way it is. So power and influence working for your interest and for the interests of those like you is always put in front of the victim. Do you follow? So when people in power use their positions to deny or to instill climates of silence and secrecy, that is all about preserving the interests of the institution, not the interests of the people in it or the persons in contact with it. First point. The second is that, normally speaking, people in positions of influence are people in possession of privilege. They don't want to lose that. And to lose that, you'll put at risk the truth. And thirdly, decisions were made, some people were involved, but a lot of people weren't. And our church still makes decisions in an exclusive club. And clericalism, which is a pejorative, is still alive and well. And it is still dominated by people who have power and privilege. Because clericalism is all about power, not about service. And when you get a cast of people that are surrounding each other in a protective way and almost recasting reality accordingly, you've got a subculture within a culture. Now, those sort of questions, I think, will be explored in February. So will questions to do with the way the Church's canon law interrelates with the civil law. So will there be questions around the use of confidential conversations as opposed to the confessional. There's a word some people use called mental reservation, which I've got no idea what that is. It's some property development east of here. There'll be issues to do with the screening of candidates, the type of training people now receive when they're in seminaries and formation houses, the ongoing support that is or isn't available for people in religious life and in the priesthood, so that they don't live these, desperate lives of isolation and dysfunction. So we're not talking about, an easy conversation, but a necessary one. And may I finish with this? We all hope that when the report comes down at the end of 2017, that it is a pointer for not only a safer future for children in any institution that they contact with, but in the case of ourselves, that we actually find in it a framework around reform of our church. The bishops and religious leaders are wanting to have a church plenary in 2020, sort of a national synod, where they say at the moment that every issue can be on the table. So if we decide to say those issues should be classified under power, privilege and participation, it should be an exciting couple of days. Thanks very much.